Welcome. Good evening. Thanks for being here tonight. Welcome to our hybrid public meeting on the future of tank waste at Department of Energy's Hanford site. My name is Ryan Worth. I'm with the contractor named Enviro Issues, and I'm hired to moderate tonight's session. And my role here is to support everyone's participation and experience at the meeting. So first I'll ask, can you hear me loud and clear in the back? Okay. Yeah. Great. Yeah, I will. Thank you. I wanted to start off by in our first slide here, just reminding folks of the purpose of this meeting, which is this evening to provide an informative overview of the Hanford site, to look at the proposed changes to the tri-party agreement and consent decree, and to answer your questions so that you can submit any comments about those proposed changes. There's a 90-day comment period that's currently open. It began on May 30th and it concludes September 1st. We do appreciate your participation tonight, and we have, this is the third in a series of meetings. We had a meeting on Tuesday in Richland and last night in Olympia. All have had hybrid participation options, so welcome to those who are joining us online as well. I wanted to remind folks that all comments during the comment period need to be submitted in writing. And so the TPA agencies aren't accepting verbal comments at tonight's session or capturing this discussion as part of that formal comment record. However, this meeting and the other meetings are being recorded for your reference, and the recordings from the past two evenings are both posted online, both to the Department of Energy and Department of Ecology's websites. All right, as far as our agenda tonight, we will have an overview presentation by our tri-party agency representatives, who I'm going to introduce here shortly. And then we're going to move into a question and answer session, which is really meant to be the heart of this meeting, an exchange and dialogue. We will end with some concluding remarks from our panel up front here. As you saw, the meeting's advertised to end at 8 p.m. Depending on how many questions we have remaining as we approach that time, we may extend up to another 30 minutes. But we'll need to wrap the meeting by 8:30 tonight. I'd like to make a couple of comments about our public meeting guidelines for this evening and what I'll be looking out for as I'm supporting you all. One is, again, our focus is on dialogue. And so we're looking to have a session that allows for exchange of your questions and responses that can be helpful as you prepare to submit public comments. And in pursuit of that, I'd like to make sure that we know what your questions are. So if you wouldn't mind at least paraphrasing them up front so that we know where you're headed, and feel free to provide some context to your question as well. But in the interest of making sure as many people can speak tonight and as many questions can get out there, try to be concise in your remarks, and I'll ask that our panelists do so as well. And of course, we expect that there are strong opinions, differences in perspective on these issues, and all perspectives are welcome in this room this evening. I just ask that we all work to maintain a respectful dialogue and mutual exchange so that everyone feels comfortable sharing and participating. A few additional housekeeping notes for everyone. For those of you here in the Hood River Hotel, we do have emergency exits. The door that you may have come in here up these couple of steps, there's another exit over to this side, and there's an ADA accessible exit through the curtains there off to your right-hand side. There's also restrooms there in the back of the room to your right, and there's water available. There are glasses and a little spigot there, so help yourself. On your chairs, there's a postcard that has a link to the comment opportunity and some other information with background, including tonight's meeting materials, as well as a separate link to our meeting evaluation form. And for those of you who are joining us online, we've shared that link in the chat. We'll be using the chat feature again tonight in Microsoft Teams, and so you can submit questions that way using the chat box. And Colleen's going to be helping again and keeping a queue. We're going to be moving back and forth between the room and online. And you can either read the question yourself or we'll read it off for you. Just checking once again, is there anyone who's just joining us by telephone? And if you are, you can unmute yourself using *6. Okay, I'm assuming that we don't have anyone on telephone, and so I'm going to skip over the details of that channel. But I will have some other instructions as we get to the Q&A portion. I also want to acknowledge that we had some audio issues last night in Olympia and in the room, and we've made some adjustments, hopefully to improve that. But if anyone's having trouble hearing in the room or online, please let us know so that we can make further adjustments, okay? Great, so with that, I'd now like to introduce folks in front of the room here, the Tri-Party Agency representatives with us tonight from the Department of Energy, Brian Vance, the Hanford Site Manager, Mark Silverstein, who's the Hanford Site Chief Counsel, and from Washington State, Stephanie Schleif, Nuclear Waste Program Manager for the State Department of Ecology, Andy Fitz, the Senior Assistant Attorney General, and from the Environmental Protection Agency, Tim Hamlin, Land Chemicals and Redevelopment Division Director for Region 10. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to them for opening remarks, starting with Mr. Vance.
Good evening, welcome tonight. Glad you're here. In addition to Mark and I, we also have Delmar Moyes, who's the Assistant Manager for our Tank Waste Operations team. And he'll answer some of the questions we get on maybe more of the technical discussions. Really glad that we're here tonight. The agreement we'll be discussing is a culmination of 4 years of really dedicated effort between the department and our regulatory partners in the state of Washington and with the Environmental Protection Agency. And really sets the course for the tank waste mission, really the next chapter of our Hanford cleanup for probably the next 15 or 20 years. The effort to reach the agreement, and Mark will talk about, and Mark and Andy will talk about the number of sessions, that it was about 100, also created a greater mutual understanding of the tank waste mission. I think ultimately enhance the working relationships between the department and our regulatory partners to ensure that we can work together effectively and more efficiently as we move that part of our mission forward. I look forward to a constructive dialogue tonight. As we stated, we're here to provide information that we hope is helpful for you in the public comment process. And so that's, we've had some very good discussions and very helpful questions and feedback over the last couple of sessions, and I think tonight will be the same. I think the element that helps us have respectful and constructive discussions is we all want the same thing. We all want a cleaner, safer Hanford site, very complex cleanup. But I think we are making progress, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the fact that we can have these conversations about difficult issues, hopefully we're all centering on that common ground that we all have, and that will help, I think, make the discussions constructive. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Schleif.
Thank you, Brian. I want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. Excellent. So as Brian said, I'm Stephanie Schleif. I'm the Nuclear Waste Program Manager for Washington State Department of Ecology. With me, I also have a few folks that will help me answer any technical questions that you have. I have Teresa Howell, who's our Compliance and Regulatory Assistant Section Manager, Suzanne Dahl, our Teen Waste Treatment Section Manager, and then also in the back, I have Brian Miller, who is our Communications Manager. Also with us is Andy Fitz, who is with the Washington State Attorney General's Office. The Attorney General's Office represented ecology in this negotiation, and as such, I've asked Andy to cover the details that we put out as part of this agreement. It's a bunch of excitement that we're here with you this evening, speaking about an agreement that's the result of years of mediated dialogue between my office, Department of Energy, and EPA. The proposed agreement marks a huge achievement for our agencies, and we believe it lays out a durable framework that shows alignment and accelerates work in a way that ensures a safe tank waste retrieval and treatment mission at the site. The tank waste mission at the site is arguably some of the hardest, if not the hardest, piece of Hanford to clean up. The proposed agreement lays the groundwork for us to move that mission forward as tri-parties. Some of you, I see some familiar faces, have heard this presentation before. Some of you, this might be your first time. As such, we've added some overview slides for Hanford so we can level set to make sure everyone has a big set of information for background for Hanford tonight. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing any questions that you have for us. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Sid Hamlin.
Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie and I have said most of what I think needs to be said, so I'll just echo and amplify that we're proud of the work we've done over the last 4 years to build a solid agreement and to establish stronger relationships that we believe will allow us to make continued progress to addressing the tank waste mission. We're happy to tell you more about it, and we are also eager to hear what you think about it, what questions you have about it, and we'll do our best to respond to your questions and concerns. I should say too, I came with someone here from EPA as well, Nick Pajarkis from Regional Council, president of us this evening as well. And I guess with that, it's back to you, Martin, for the overview.
Okay, great slide. So when we developed this presentation, it was thought it'd be helpful to kind of provide a history of the Hanford site from 1943 to today, which is for context for discussion we're having relative to the tank waste mission. Obviously, the mission site is much broader, but we'll get into that as well. 1943, the Hanford site was established as a part of the Manhattan Project effort to start weapons program development, and this for the Hanford site specifically plutonium production. That mission extended beyond World War II through the Cold War until about 1989, when the mission for the site fully transitioned from national security and weapons production to environmental cleanup. The period of the national security mission that ran for 45 years, just a couple of statistics about what was done out there. About 20 million uranium metal fuel rods produced, irradiated in one of 9 reactors along the Columbia River at various times during the mission. And then once the irradiated rods were had been in the reactor long enough to produce plutonium, they were removed, cooled, and then sent down to the Central Plateau for processing. The processing process itself was very chemically intensive, which manifested the need for 177 underground tanks to store the mixed chemical and radioelectrical waste, as the site produced about 60% of plutonium in the nation. What you see behind you where it talks about the National Monument area, that's more of a current day state of play. That area was largely security and buffer when the site was established. The river corridor is where the 9 reactors were. It's also actually where the fuel was produced down in the southern area of the site, in the 300 area. And then the Central Plateau was where the processing occurred. Next slide. Hanford today, really since 1989, it's only an environmental cleanup mission. We don't have any other mission in Hanford site. We're one of 15 sites remaining in the nation. When the process began across the country, there was over 100 sites. And Hanford's the largest and most complex and likely to last, but the department and the Office of Environmental Management have made significant progress across the rest of the country and in Hanford as well in remediating those sites that were necessary for the national security needs of the nation. The site is 580 square miles. South central Washington, you can see the insert on the slide behind me that shows where that is, about 50 miles of the Columbia River. We operate, the Department of Energy is the owner and the customer and contractors. You can see the offices.
Health issues and for me, I see their parents as well.
We've got somebody who's online and that we're in the process of muting. Okay, thank you.
So the 2 offices, the Richland Operations Office, is really the site, safety, security, infrastructure, and more traditional remediation, which includes building demolition, soil remediation and groundwater programs. The officer protection is really focused on the tank waste mission. And we're actually in the process of combining two offices or recombining two offices later this year. We have 6 prime contractors, and we are the site integrator, provide strategic direction and create conditions for the contractors to work together to progress the mission. We operate within a congressional appropriation of FY24 is just over $3 billion for the cleanup mission. We employ about 12,000 people in the cleanup effort between the federal members of the federal team, our support contractors, the prime contractors, and the subcontractors that the primes employ to do work across various parts of the site. And while our focus tonight is on the baseline listed negotiations, is on the tank waste mission. I think you can see in the slide, I kept on the other areas of the site that we're continuing to progress the mission as well, that are well beyond just the tank waste mission. The tank waste mission, again, is going to be our focus as a result of the agreement that we just came into fruition with the state of Washington and the Environmental Protection Agency. Next slide. Over the first 35 years of the cleanup, we've really accomplished quite a bit. Not always recognized for the progress. If you look at just the upper left-hand side of that block slide there, we have 9 reactors on the river. One's a national park. 7 are in interstate storage, which means they're in long-term storage, will be there for 75 years until they can be remediated. And the infrastructure around those facilities has largely been remediated as well. We've taken almost 19 million tons of soil and debris to our on-site regulated landfill. We've knocked down almost 1,000 facilities. We're approaching that now. We've remediated 1,000 waste sites. The 220,000 gallons in the lower right quad is actually lower than it is right now. It's about 365,000 a week because we're operating the tank site seed removal system today. And we're continuing to treat waste that we will feed to the waste treatment plant next year. We retrieved 21 underground tanks. We just finished the second full retrieval process of the tank farm, the physical retrieval. The paperwork's going to work its way through. And we treated 34 billion gallons of groundwater and removed 680 tons of contaminants. And we treat about 2 billion gallons per year. This will be the 10th year in a row we've accomplished. So again, beyond the tank waste mission we'll talk about, a lot more also being done with the investment by the federal government. And we'll continue the cleanup for decades. We'll be likely at the site until 2070s, 2080s before we're done. If that's an important element to understand, that the duration of the mission and the cleanup is really long term. And when I talk about the fact that we'll be there last, I think that's accurate. We'll probably be the last second cleanup mission. Next slide. A little bit of a focus slice of the Central Plateau looking towards the west. And I'll start on the western side. You can see the 200 west area at the top of the slide. There are, I have a couple of inserts there. That's one area of the site that has a number of tank farms, and I'll detail that. The reason I put on the slide is 5 to 7 miles between what's in the lower part of the picture and that blue sliver that looks like it's just next door. That's quite a long way. And that's an important part of the broader story we'll talk about as we go forward. The tank waste mission program tonight, we think about the east tank farms. We have 91 tanks, underground tanks in the east tank farms. 25 of those 91 are double shell tanks. 24 remain in operation. And you can see the green nomenclature, the color by the tank farms, those are single shell tanks. The blue are the double shell tanks. Double shell tanks are newer. We have a robust tank integrity program, which will continue to monitor and manage the chemistry in double shell tanks to extend the duration and life of those tanks as far as we can. The retrieval effort is basically transferring waste from older single shell tanks into newer double shell tanks to be staged, be immobilized, and ultimately dispositioned. We start, as I mentioned, we completed the C farm a while ago, AX farm within the last 6 weeks from a physical completion perspective, and we'll start the first A farm tank this month to retrieve. So we're making good progress there. And then, the treatment of tank waste prepared for the waste treatment plant, the tank side cesium removal system is operating today. This is our 7th batch of, I think they'll want to make sure, I think that's accurate. And, again, we're about 360,000 gallons. We intend to have over 800,000 gallons prepared and staged, by the end of this year for the waste treatment plant next year. Then you look at the bottom of the picture, that 65-acre campus is the waste treatment plant itself. The two parts I'll talk about, the parts associated with direct feed low activity waste, or the part that we're moving forward with in the near term. Those are the facilities that look complete with the green roofs, and parking lots and everything completed, because that part of the facility is done. Construction is complete, startup testing is complete, and we're in the commissioning. We have 2 hot melters. We poured glass for each melter, clean glass, that is part of the commissioning program. And so we're making great progress there. And that includes the lab facility, the effluent management facility, and then the 14 service facilities there for power, water, steam, things like that, that make the whole DFL program go. And that really is an exciting part of the current chapter we're in. And then you'll see at the top of that campus is sort of where next down a little bit. On the right is the pretreatment facility, on the left is the highway waste facility. In 2012, we stopped progressing those 2 facilities. There were technical issues that needed to be resolved, so the engineering could progress, so the construction could progress, and we didn't risk going back into the rework if we had to go resolve engineering issues. So the department shifted focus to direct feed low activity waste, which will be a large part of what we're talking about today, really the near next phase of the cleanup. Highland waste facility, we're going to progress the design, and there's already construction being resumed there. And then the pretreatment facility will be a decision for another day. But there's really, if you think about that 65-acre island, there's two islands there. We think of them as islands. One is the operating island for direct feed low activity waste. One is a construction island. And that demarcation is important for our team, but also important to recognize the functions that are occurring in both those locations. Look at the next slide. I'll go through this quickly. As I mentioned, most of these elements, but the part that's different today, we're treating tank waste at industrial scale to prepare that waste for shipment over to the waste treatment plant to be immobilized in glass next year. Waste treatment plant is in commission, 2 hot melters, going through its testing phase. We'll go through a number of phases as we work our way towards the start of tank waste vitrification next year. The effluent treatment facility, which is, you can see to the right, we didn't kind of carve that out, but that's going through upgrades now to support the byproducts management when the waste treatment plant is operating. Those are in the final phases now, and we'll have those ready for when the waste treatment plant's ready to move forward. And you can see the integrated disposal facility to the upper left. That's where the glass containers will go when they're completed. That's another regulated landfill. And the part that is also important is to recognize that we've got 77 permits to operate the plant. We have 76 in hand. And Stephanie and her team have done a great job. They're not the last one. It's like Washington Department of Health, and we're on the track to have that by the end of the year. So really a good news story overall. And then, as I mentioned, direct feed high-level waste, which we talk about, bypasses the pretreatment functions. Direct feed, very similar to what we'll do for low activity waste for the first phase. And then we'll continue to crawl, walk, run into the other parts of that high-level waste inventory. We need this additional ultimately as well. And lastly, just the last slide, just 200 West, 86 tanks, 7 tank farms, 1 tank farm of double shell tanks with 3 tanks, and that'll be germane to the discussion later as well. And then when we talk about the 22 tanks in the agreement, those will be coming out of SX and U tank farms. And then we'll talk about the cross-site transfer line. The cross-site transfer line really connects the west farms to the east farms, which gives us flexibility to move waste, not only for a pilot waste facility in the future, but also potentially for the low activity waste facility as well. And so from a big picture perspective, in the east, we're treating today, we're poised to vitrify next year. In west, with this agreement at the later part of the decade, we'll be in a position to start retrieving, and then we'll talk about the ground solution for low activity waste in the west farm. So vitrifying east, grouting in the west, and progressing the mission forward into the future as we build that waste facility. So it's an exciting time for us. The transformation of the site, beyond the physical transformation, is also a cultural transformation. The waste treatment plant is a one-of-a-kind, first-of-a-kind plant. Every day we do something new. Nobody's ever done that before. And so as we progress in the commissioning program and work through the processes that we have to do to bring that plant to life, our team is doing a phenomenal job of finding, fixing, learning, growing as we move forward. And the work that the department does at the site is anchored first and foremost every single day on the health and safety of our workforce. As we progress the mission, as we protect the community, as we protect the environment. So the workforce culture, the safety culture, ops culture is all part of it. And that transition's been 5 years so far, and we're on path with the machine, but we still have some work to do. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark to go into details of the agreement itself. Good evening. Good evening. We're all gunshot now. You want the one that you know what? Oh, there you go. There we go. Good evening. As Brian said, I'm Mark Silverstein. I'm Hanford Site Chief Counsel. So you all may have heard a lot about holistic agreement, holistic negotiation. Well, what is a holistic agreement? As Brian said, I like to summarize it in one sentence as a proposal that sets us on a course for the Hanford tank waste retrieval and treatment mission for approximately the next 20 years. If you're looking for a general time frame associated with a holistic agreement, it's basically through now through 2040, with some more near-term commitments and some longer-term commitments in that time period. The story of holistic agreement and negotiations actually goes back to 2020 when we actually started the confidential mediation sessions. Brian said, I think we set some sort of record with about 100 mediation sessions between that time and our announcement in May of the conceptual agreement. And there were a couple of key documents that I think are worth mentioning. While we can't talk about the substance of what the parties discussed in those confidential discussions, these documents did inform the negotiations. One is an analysis of alternatives that was performed on the path forward for high-level waste treatment. Another was a series of system planning documents. Now, these aren't necessarily decision documents so much as a system plan is a document that looks at a variety of alternatives or scenarios or ways in which we might accomplish the Hanford cleanup mission. And also we have the test bed initiative, which is a test that's currently underway and we're pursuing to look at the alternative treatment technology for grout for the low activity portion of our waste. It's a 2,000 gallon test that we hope to be kicking off soon. And so the environmental assessment under the National Environmental Policy Act, EPA, the WEIR, waste incidental to reprocessing determination, and the EPA variance associated with the test bed initiative that I mentioned was another set of key documents that informed negotiations. So going back to, again, what is the holistic agreement? It's three parts. Number one, it's a settlement agreement, which is essentially the overarching part of the three parts. It includes references to the public comment period and some other substantive provisions that we're going to speak to in a little bit more detail later. In addition, we have proposed changes to a federal consent decree. Andy's going to talk a little bit more about the history of the consent decree. We also have proposed changes to the tri-party agreement, also known as the TPA, which is a federal facility compliance agreement. Typically, changes to the TPA are effectuated through what we call a change package. And so if you've looked at the holistic agreement online and you've seen these various appendices that are titled change package or milestone package, those are proposed changes in the vehicle used to make changes to the tri-party agreement. Next slide.
Thanks, Mark, and good evening. I'm Andy Pitts with the Washington Attorney General's office. So before I start talking about the specific highlights, I'll give you a little background on sort of the legal overlay of Hanford cleanup, because I think it's helpful to understand then what changes we're talking about. So in 1989, the state of Washington, EPA, and Department of Energy entered into the tri-party agreement. And from the state's part, one of of the three legs of it is that it's a state enforcement order under our authority. Well, it's related to a federal law called the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. Basically, we regulate hazardous waste, the chemical waste that's part of the mix in the tanks and the areas around Hanford. So this was an administrative order saying you need to come into compliance with the standards that apply to facilities that store hazardous waste or treat hazardous waste or dispose of hazardous waste. And there are conditions in RCRA that really drive the need for getting the waste out of the tanks and treating it through something like the waste treatment plant. So that was the original framework in which there were milestones, as we call them, sort of 8 for building the waste treatment plant, getting waste out of tanks and closing those tank farms in compliance with RCRA standards. In the early 2000s, DOE started construction of the waste treatment plant, but the state was concerned that that wasn't progressing quickly enough. And we ended up in 2008 filing a federal court lawsuit to try to push that progress along. That resulted in a settlement in 2010 that included 2 big parts. One part is something called a consent decree. So that's basically an agreed judicial order that's entered in court and overseen by a federal court judge. The consent decree deals with the dates for completing the construction of the waste treatment plant and what are called the initial operations. So basically the ramp up period to get to, sort of day-to-day operations moving forward. And it also included deadlines for retrieving 19 of those underground tanks. And then there were changes to the tri-party agreement that carried us through to the end of those missions of getting the waste out of all the tanks, closing the tank farms, and treating all the waste. So when we entered the consent decree, the dates for finishing construction of the waste treatment plant were 2019 for the 3 major facilities. So there's something called the pre-treatment facility, which is where the tank waste first needs to come, then split into 2 different waste streams. One of them has 90% of the radioactivity, but is 10% of the volume. So it's concentrating the radioactivity and then sending the 90% remainder, which is mostly chemical waste, to something called the low activity waste facility. And then in the tri-party agreement, those end dates for completing these missions were 2040 for getting the waste out of the tanks, 2043 for closing all the tank farms, and 2047 for finishing the treatment of all that waste. Fast forward 13 months later, principally the pre-treatment plant had technical challenges that then put sort of the whole complex behind schedule again. We attempted to negotiate sort of a path forward around that difficulty. We ended up not being able to reach agreement, and we went back to court and had competing versions of how to modify the consent decree that went before the federal judge. And what came out of that was some new dates for the waste treatment plant. So for that low activity waste facility, it's technically possible to remove some of the key radionuclides, the radioactive material, and have some liquid that's already in the tanks go to the low activity waste facility without that pre-treatment facility finished. It's called direct feed. So you'll hear direct feed low activity waste. It's basically taking out the key radionuclides on sort of beside the tanks and then sending that waste to the lab facility. So that date was, well, it's now 2025 because of COVID, and there was a bump just because they couldn't work for a period. For the high level waste facility, the new date set by the judge was 2033. That's also the same date for finishing the pre-treatment facility. So then we fast forward a little bit further, and Mark mentioned that we started this discussion in 2020. Leading into it, Energy had, focused a lot of effort on getting the direct feed low activity waste facility up and running. We were concerned that they were still had not really moved forward with the pre-treatment facility or the high level waste facility. And that was, creating uncertainty about when this is all going to end. So we started this process rather than immediately going back to court, which, you know, really is sort of a blunt tool for resolving complex problems. We put a lot of effort into trying to talk and arrive at a common solution. So that's a really long lead into this slide where I'm going to talk about sort of the key changes. So the first two messages are there aren't key changes. So we are sticking by the 2025 date for getting low activity waste facilities starting to treat real tank waste. And the 2033 date for starting to treat high level waste in the high level waste facility. What has changed is the reliance on that pre-treatment facility as originally envisioned. You actually don't need to have a pre-treatment facility to treat high-level waste. You can just plumb it directly to this building. The big aspect of pre-treatment is to concentrate the radionuclides into a smaller waste stream, so you produce fewer canisters of glass that need to be disposed of somewhere in a deep geologic repository. Out of an effort that Mark mentioned, an analysis of alternatives, the quickest way to start treating high-level waste was to do a similar direct feed of that facility. So that's going to keep that facility on schedule. I mean, in complete candor, there may be some adjustment of that when DOE does a more detailed schedule for how to get there. But I think our expectation is if there's a change, it's not going to be dramatic within, 1 to 3 years. So for the pre-treatment facility, really the benefit of that is being more efficient about how you produce, the total volume of waste. There's something called sludge washing, which removes the chemicals out of that high-level waste stream that allows it to be further concentrated. We're going to plug in those functions after the high-level waste facility starts. And, it's a sort of stepwise approach, but it allows those pre-treatment functions to be, right-sized, if you will, when the high-level waste facility actually starts operating. So those milestones for completing the pre-treatment functions will be put into the consent decree in a negotiation that occurs 18 months after the high-level waste facility starts running, where we've got the experience and are able to say, okay, here's what's needed at the time. Next slide, please. So part of what supports the direct feed of the high-level waste facility is building two facilities that sort of take the place of functions that pre-treatment facility was going to provide. One is called an effluent management facility, and the other is called a waste transfer vault. So part of the proposal that's out for review is a process for developing a schedule for those facilities and then having milestones that allow those facilities to be built to support the direct feed high-level waste operation. And those are the two facilities you see mentioned in the last bullet. Mark, it's back to you.
So continuing with some of the consent decree aspects, the agreement does maintain a schedule for completing the retrievals through the consent decree, which is 9 tanks in ANAX farm by 2028. However, we are extending the deadlines for 2 of the tanks, A104 and 105. Those 2 tanks have some significant tank condition issues and retrieval challenges. So they are on their own trajectory for retrieval. And the department has the ability to substitute 2 tanks in its place to complete the 9 originally envisioned under the consent decree. Tank A105, for example, is got a tear in the bottom of the liner 3/4 of the way around from a eruption, a steam event in the 1970s. So not a great candidate for retrieval technologies that might involve liquid. So, and Andy will speak a little bit later about another aspect of the agreement with respect to new retrieval technologies. And it pertains in part to, how we might go back and address tanks like the 105 or future tanks that have tank condition issues, including things like tanks with wavy bottoms and other challenges in the retrieval process. Among the ANAX farms, there's one remaining tank I like to call the lonely tank, tank A103, which is the last tank of the ANAX farms that needs to be retrieved It's currently required to be retrieved by the tri-party agreement, and so we're simply extending that milestone to 2028 to align with the retrieval sequence of the rest of the tanks in those farms. So after we complete the retrievals in ANAX farm, which again is through 2028, the question that we had discussed was, where are we going to go next for retrievals? What the parties decided was 22 tanks from among the S, SX, and U farms in the west area of the site by 2040. In tandem with that, because this is in the west part of the site, which is, again, Brian explained, is approximately 7 miles from the east area where the WTP is, the discussion was about, pursuing alternative treatment technologies for the low activity portion of the waste in those tanks. What this agreement proposes is that waste will be retrieved from the 22 tanks, routed and disposed of out of the state of Washington. What we have not decided yet is where it will be routed and what routes they will take to get there. So, there's no decision made on those two aspects. That's because there's a series of processes we have to go through before we make that decision. One of which is including this public comment period that we're in for a holistic agreement. We also have to do our NEPA review, any other additional applicable regulatory processes. We'll have to do a WIR, as I said earlier, which is a waste incidental to reprocessing determination about whether or not the waste is through the department's authorities, high-level waste or not. We'll have to do a business case analysis, which will look at on-site or local routing options versus farther away routing options, if you will, at the respective disposal facilities, which are in Clive, Utah, and in Texas. And so, with this aspect, we know that there are some questions and concerns we've heard already about the 22 tanks and where it's going to be routed and transportation routes. So we encourage you all to make the comments. And, we're hearing you. We understand that there's a lot of questions about it. And the department will continue to assess whether there are additional public engagement opportunities associated with this decision as we continue to go forward and we hear your comments. So, as I mentioned, that's the proposal for the 22 tanks. There are some very specific conditions associated with that. One I mentioned is that waste has to be disposed of out of the state of Washington. Another is what we call just-in-time scaling, which is essentially not creating a backlog at the Hanford site of the pre-treated waste as it's removed from the tanks. And those conditions remain in place through at least 2040.
So the highlights Mark was just covering are in the tri-party agreement, not the consent decree. So we're now talking about tri-party agreement proposed changes. So another is, although it's in the tri-party agreement, it does relate a bit to those 2 tanks that Mark mentioned that will be delayed. They're difficult to retrieve tanks, and they sort of epitomize some of the challenges that I think both the state as regulator and DOE see in the future as the time goes on to get waste out of these tanks. Basically, we need to have a broader suite of retrieval technologies to fit more challenging tanks. So part of the agreement is having the Department of Energy convene an independent panel of experts to advise it on possible new or improved current retrieval approaches. So one example would be a tank that has, the potential to leak. The current retrieval approach largely is to introduce liquids in high pressure to sort of break up waste in the tank. And that's probably not a good idea if you have the potential for a leak, right? So more dry retrieval technologies is one of the areas of focus. Mark mentioned tanks with wavy bottoms. So another example is, being able to get waste out of little deeper pockets where you've got basically valleys or non-conformities at the tank bottom. So you get the expert panel to advise DOE on routes to go with new technologies. And then DOE is obligated to carry at least 2 of those new technologies forward into a phased testing and development process to try and develop those new tank retrieval technologies. And there is the milestone that sort of sets out the process for how that gets put into place. Another aspect is agreement for DOE to build and construct 1 million gallons of new tank storage capacity. This would be on the west side of Hanford, where I think Brian mentioned that there were currently three operating double shell tanks. And not decided yet whether the new storage capacity will be a new large double shell tank or a series of smaller double shell tanks or some other storage space that can sort of best maximize the efficiency of tank waste management in that area. But we do have that agreement. And it's become operational by 2040. It's kind of amazing to think about, but basically as you map out the timeline from beginning the design to actual completion of construction and starting operation of a new tank, it's about a 10-year period. Next slide, please. There are also proposed milestones for activating 2 cross-site transfer lines. So these provide the future mechanism to get waste moving from those west side tank farms at Hanford to the east side of Hanford where the waste treatment plant is located. Currently, there's not a mechanism for moving that waste, and that's part of why the ground approach is being proposed to move forward with those west area tank retrievals. That waste currently there's not a physical way for it to get to the waste treatment plant. So it's called alternative treatment and alternative to the waste treatment plant. The next bullet is something that is really sort of down in the weeds for Hanford lovers, but it's actually, in my mind, something that's kind of significant. So Mark mentioned something called the system plan. It's a fancy name for something that we came up with in 2010 to have a common, sort of set of assumptions for the state and the Department of Energy to talk about the future of the mission. So it's a modeling run. It simulates different ways of retrieving tanks in different orders, for instance, or different, approaches to the mission. And you can then compare scenarios and see, oh, we can, cut some time out by doing it this way. Or, what happens if we prioritize certain tanks for risk reasons over others? How does that affect the mission? Those are examples. When we developed that common modeling approach in 2010, we also agreed to negotiate certain topics around those runs every 6 years. So those included like setting the milestones for the next set of tanks to be retrieved in 8-year chunks. It also included talking about whether we need additional tank capacity. So that was an every 6-year topic. And then looking at those end dates and whether they needed adjustment. One of the public comments that came in 2010 is, hey, 6 years is a long time to wait between those negotiations. And that idea came back around this time. So we're increasing the frequency of the tank sequencing topic and the contingency measure topic. In other words, whether new tank capacity is needed, among other things, as every 3-year topics. And then bigger things like end dates every 6 years. So I mentioned a few minutes ago those milestones for completing the big parts of the mission. So 2040 for getting all the waste out of the tanks, 2047 for getting it all treated. We have not changed those dates. And we've got some questions around why not. And it was basically the state's position that we did not want to change those dates until we had better information to have realistic dates reset in the tri-party agreement. So the dates are still there. We've acknowledged that they are not currently reachable. I mean, they won't be reachable currently or ever. But they remain on the books with sort of 2 features around it. One is language that says the Department of Energy is still obligated to work toward those milestones, getting those missions completed as expeditiously as possible. And second, we've got, all of these near-term milestones for the next 15 plus years that all are things that need to happen to reach those end dates. So we've got near-term milestones, for the next 15 plus years. We intend to reset those dates at roughly the same time that the high-level waste facility begins operating, because at that point, we think we'll have better information to set realistic dates. Just to sort of repeat the concern, we didn't want to set new dates. And once you set new dates, they always seem to move in one direction, which is even later. So we wanted to hold off on doing that until we have the best information available. In the meantime, if Energy just walks away from the job, we still have the obligation to complete the mission on the books. We still have the language that says they need to be working toward it. And we still have the milestones that say they have to do 22 tank retrievals and finish the waste treatment plant and move forward with treatment before we reset those dates. I think that covered everything. All right.
And we're not walking away from the job, just to clarify.
Yeah.
So the last,
Hypothetical.
thank you. So the last aspect, or really the first that I described, the settlement agreement. Let's talk about some of the more substantive provisions or aspects of that. Number one, it includes a statement that DOE will forbear and refrain from applying the high-level waste interpretation at Hanford. What does this mean? It means that the high-level waste interpretation is one of the authorities the Department of Energy has to determine what is or what is not high-level waste. There is a respective difference of opinion and legal position between the regulatory agencies and DOE as to the extent of that authority. And so, we collectively decided to sort of set aside and preserve our differences of opinion on that. And DOE intends to refrain from applying it at Hanford. In addition, the agreement, as I said, charts a proposed course for pursuing things like alternative treatment technologies or gravel without use of the high-level waste interpretation. So it sets us on a course to basically test the regulatory pathway or further evaluate the regulatory pathway without the high-level waste interpretation. This forbearance does not affect DOE's other authorities to determine what is or what is not high-level waste. So, for example, I mentioned the WIR process. Again, this does not affect the waste incidental to reprocessing determinations or WIR determinations. Another aspect of the settlement agreement is it gives a nod to some future discussions that we're slated to have, which is with respect to two appendices to the tri-party agreement, Appendix H and I. They deal with tank retrievals and tank closure respectively. We will get back together to talk about whether there's any updates or changes to those appendices that are necessary. Frankly, some aspects of those appendices are somewhat dated. They date back to 1989, and so we need to make some updates at a minimum. And so we're going to talk about what those might be. We'll also discuss offsite ground disposal conditions. Remember those conditions I mentioned earlier on the other slide, if any, that should continue after they're set to expire. And lastly, the settlement agreement expressly acknowledges that the department will complete applicable regulatory processes like NEPA, the National Historic Preservation Act. That language is in the settlement agreement itself. I'll turn it back over now to Stephanie for next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So I'll cover briefly the next couple of slides and I'll be quick so you can go away with any questions. So next steps for the agreement is out for public comment. We'll complete the public comment period, which, as Ryan said at the beginning of the meeting, runs for a total of 90 days and ends on September 1st. After the public comment period, we'll review any comments that you provided us as tri-party agencies, and we'll issue a response to comments document. As Mark referred to, Department of Energy will complete any applicable regulatory processes, such as those under the National Environmental Policy Act, or the National Historic Preservation Act. And then finally, once we agree on any changes that need to be made to the agreement based on your public comment, we'll implement proposed amendments to the consent decree in the Federal District Courts. And then finally, our agencies will also sign and implement proposed revisions to the tri-party agreement. Next slide. Again, just highlighting that we want to hear from you. We've been holding public meetings this week. On Tuesday, we were in Richland. Yesterday, we were in Olympia, and today we're with you in Hood River. And like I said, you can provide us comments through September 1st, a couple of ways. You can submit them electronically through that link there, or you can also send them written to us at the Department of Ecology in Richland. And if you're wondering where to focus your attention in reviewing the change package, recognize it's about 100 pages. The changes to the consent decree and the check reading agreement start on page 19 if that is you. With that, I'll turn it over to Ryan to lead us to questions.
Great. Thank you for the presentation. We're now ready to move to the Q&A portion of our session here. And so I just have a few reminders before we get going. We're going to be working both here in the room and online, taking a question here and then from the group as they have them. The purpose, again, of the questions is to help answer any clarifications needed to help you tailor your comments for the public comment period around these changes that have been described. Let's see, for those of you in the room, we have a mic runner, Patrick here. So just raise your hand and we'll come over to you so you can speak into the mic. And for those of you online, you can identify yourself and speak into the room, or we can read that question off for you. Use the chat function to put in your questions. When we get to you, if you could state your name and your question, and then followed with any necessary context. And I'm going to repeat the question or paraphrase so that everyone can hear. Again, that's one of those adjustments. We had some issues last night. So once we hear your question, we'll repeat it and then we'll respond. We're going to ask that you stick to one question at a time, and we're going to try to do first round questions. And then if you've got follow-up questions, we'll move to second round. But we want to give everyone who has a question at least one shot before we move into second round. So please hold those follow-ups or second questions. And it's okay to ask clarification about the response if it's specific to that response. But again, when it comes to second questions or follow-ups, I'd like to hold those. And in asking those clarifications, please let the panel respond and don't interrupt. If we've heard your question already, we may refer to a previous response, just in the interest of time. And I will ask that everyone keep their questions and remarks as concise as possible. Again, so we can get as much exchange here going. I'm going to be checking time. We're set to wrap at 8, but we'll continue to monitor and extend if we've got more questions in the queue. So with that, I think we're ready to get going, and we can start with a question in the room. I see a hand right here.
Hi, Tom Cecilia, Oregon Department of Energy. Just clarifying question, when we're talking between 2028 and 2040, we're retrieving 22 tanks from the west side. Is that concurrent with retrievals on the east side? If it is, how are you going to staff that? And if it's not, what's the feed for DFLAW?
And so just to repeat, in terms of retrievals, is it on the west side, is it concurrent with the east side? And how does that relate to DFLAW?
So the retrievals are not concurrent. So the idea is that we will complete the retrievals in the east area, A and AX, and then start to work on the west area retrievals. And that's, quite frankly, I think you alluded to this, there's, a certain number of resources, workforce, et cetera, that needs to be, because it's a pretty intensive endeavor when we're doing active retrievals in a tank farm. So once we complete the retrievals in the A and AX complex, which includes single shell tank farms, the idea is that we would go then to the west area to do those retrievals. And as far as the second part was with respect to feed, is that correct? So, Delmar, I don't know if you want to add to that, but we're actively working right now on the tester unit treating the waste in east area so that there's sufficient feed for the relatively waste facility.
Do I get a
Quick clarification?
Yeah, so there's enough feed for 12 years of operation. Okay.
So give Delmar the mic for that.
The short version is yes, we'll have sufficient feed in the double shell tanks in the east area for both
low activity operations and going to hazard waste stuff as well. There is sufficient hollow for 10 to 15. So that's-
Okay, at this point, we don't have any questions online, so we'll continue in the room. If you've got a question, we'll take it. In the back?
Hi, Jerry Paulette with Heart of American Northwest. Van just came on behind me, so I will come this way. Thank you again for, I think, a very well thought out presentation, 3 nights in a row. This is a little bit of repetition because there are people here tonight who didn't hear questions and concerns from public interest groups the last 2 nights and possibly online as well. We are very concerned about an agreement framed as a holistic agreement about tank wastes that alternately has been referred to as not including any agreement on currently leaking tanks, and yet also has some very clear language that explicitly refers to leaking tanks. And for background, it's very important for people to know that there are 2 admitted leaking tanks right this minute that are leaking significant quantities of waste and have been for years. Tank B109, which was acknowledged and reported as leaking in 2021, about 2 years after it was obviously leaking. And tank T111, which is in the west area, which has been leaking for well over a decade. And the leak rate appears to have accelerated and looks as if it's about 6,900 gallons per year. That is a substantial amount of liquid loss. And that is a figure that was shared with us by Dr. Steve Agnew, who formerly worked with PNNL and the Energy Department. So I do want to acknowledge that last night I said we were surprised about the T-tank farm not being on the list, and appreciate that you clarified that. I went this morning, and of course it is specified in the TPA, not proposed milestone. And indeed, I even had notes about why, and it's just important, I think, to address this. If you've got a leaking tank in the T-tank farm, why would you rule out retrieving waste from the T-tank farm, not including it in your analysis right away? Secondly, and this very closely relates to the questions from Cecilia from the Oregon Department of Energy just asked. As we've been looking at this, I'm growing concerned that there seems to be a preemption of the duty to remove leakable liquids from a tank as soon as practicable under federal and state law, which we've been told Ecology is awaiting a RCRA permit proposal from the Energy Department saying how they will respond to leaking tanks. But if the emphasis is only on retrieval, which includes getting all the salt cake and sludge out of a tank and not the drainable liquids, it seems like we're going to just sit and watch tanks leak. So would you clarify, are you still going to be evaluating removing drainable liquids as soon as practicable to stop or slow leaks from tanks? And will you be considering action in the T-tank farm, even though it's not listed in the 3 tank farms that you're considering in the 200 West area? And thirdly, will you, both as the regulatory agencies and the Energy Department, can you tell us if you expect that there will be any physical action to remove liquids that are leaking from leaking tanks before 2028, which is the date when you would begin doing something in 200 West. That third question is kind of a yes or no. Will you be planning on doing anything physically to reduce the amount of leakable liquids in leaking tanks before 2028? Thank you.
All right, I've got three questions in there that I'll paraphrase related. So first is if you've got a leaking tank in T-Tank Farms, let's see, what could you not make, why would you not include that in your analysis right away? Sorry. So again, if you've got a leaking tank in T-Tank Farms, why would you not include that in your analysis right away? Secondly, can you clarify, are you going to be evaluating the recovery of drainable liquids as soon as possible from leaking tanks? And thirdly, will you as regulators tell us if you expect action to remove or reduce liquids from leaking tanks before 2028?
So thanks, Jerry. I'm going to start, and then I think Stephanie can talk about where we are in terms of the order I'll describe, and then I think Mark has some parts to fill in. So during the course of our mediation, the Department of Ecology and Department of Energy sort of started a separate effort to negotiate an order around leaking tanks. And that really took that subject out of what we were negotiating for the package here tonight and put it in the form of a separate order that, you know, could have taken the form of an enforcement order, but ended up being a consensual order put into place. And I'm not directly involved in that, so I'm speaking from my general knowledge, but one thing it requires is for energy to prepare a more encompassing leak response plan across the complex, which hadn't existed in a form that ecology was willing to conduct prior to that date, which I think is actually what kind of led to this discussion. Another aspect is for energy to assess the practicability of retrieving those tanks. So when we talk about practicability, I mean, this is what the effort is actually supposed to look at. And practicability is a term of art. You know, it doesn't say as soon as possible, it says as soon as practicable, and there is some balancing of looking at the circumstances overall. I think, I don't want to speak for energy, but what I've understood from energy is that these are isolated tanks, and if you're going to retrieve one, and this is sort of going to Jerry, your point about retrieving in full, you need to build $1 billion of infrastructure in order to do that. Where you already have infrastructure in place to retrieve other tanks that also pose risks more quickly. So it's a choice of sort of where you spend your dollar to put one fire out when other fires are also going or potentially could burst in the flame. Which is, you know, a little more nuanced and complex than just saying you have a leak. So I can't speak to the merits of that practicability determination. Again, I'm not directly involved in it, and it isn't completed yet. I think maybe Stephanie, you can fill in where, you know, where we are in that process, and then Mark, I know you want to say something.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you, Jerry, for the question. Just so folks know, I'll start out by saying that what we call the leaking tanks agreed order, it's like Andy said, a joint order between the Department of Ecology and Department of Energy. It is out on our website if you want to read it, including all of the corrective actions that Department of Energy needs to meet. One of which Andy described, it's the single shell tank leak response plan that will go into what's called the Hanford site-wide dangerous waste permit and part of the renewal for that permit, which will be going out for public comment soon. So you all have a chance to look at it. We're actively reviewing that leak response plan and going through a comment resolution process with the Department of Energy right now on that. In addition, one of the other corrective actions that is in that agreed order is to go into negotiation with the Department of Energy to set milestones for retrieving those two leaking tanks, T109 and T111. And we haven't yet begun that negotiation. We're actively trying to set up meetings, and I think the order requires us to complete negotiation by October of this year.
Thank you. I was just going to speak to some of the actions that the department's taking to address leaking tanks. So first, Jerry mentioned the phrase leakable liquids or chummable liquids, different ways of saying it. The department undertook an extensive effort to remove chummable liquids from all of the SSTs for the alternative stabilization. That effort spanned, I don't know what the years were, 1978 to 2005. So we were under interim stabilization, removing pumpable liquids from all of the tanks, single shell tanks. In addition, there's a number of measures we put into place to prevent additional liquid from getting into tanks that may be leaking or are leaking, which we call intrusion. So, for example, you might put a cap over a tank farm, or you might seal off different places where liquid or water might try and get into a tank. Those measures are actively undertaken, and we routinely survey some of the tank farms to make sure that those measures are in place, if there's other opportunities to do so. And in accordance with the agreed order, we have some other commitments associated with additional caps to go over other tank farms, including T-Farm. Lastly, we have a robust groundwater program, which Brian spoke to, on the magnitude of billions of gallons each year is treated, which removes contaminants from the groundwater should contaminants get to the groundwater under any of these leaking tanks. And that is an expansive operation at our site. So I just thought it was helpful to highlight some of the actions that are in place to address the concerns associated with any leaking tanks.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple comments as well. It's easy sometimes to look at the site at an individual issue level. But the site is uniquely complex across a broad range of issues. And as we think about where we apply limited resources, because $3 billion is a lot of money, doesn't do everything. And so we're continuously looking to optimize the investments we make to drive the risk profile of the site down as fast as we can for the workforce, as well as for our community as we clean up the environment. And so the risk profile of Hanford is unique. And we have to continue to look at the macro level and make sure that we're not making a short-term decision that actually self-optimizes the investment. Ultimately, that's going to make our workers less safe, our community less safe in years to come. And I don't want to do that. That's a very difficult decision. And that's, when you think about the things that keep me awake at night, that's one of those things. And so we're continuously evaluating those issues. And when you talk about the tank leaks that are leaking, and Del Mar can give you the actual numbers of series and we were accurate. We're talking about a leak of a relatively small amount of liquid, 1,000 gallons or so per year, perhaps less than that in T111, in an area that there were leaking tanks during the national security mission to the tune of hundreds of thousands of gallons leaked. In areas of the tank farms where there was a cascade approach, where millions of gallons were directly dumped into the ground in vaults and cribs. And so we have a leaking tank below ground, 40 feet or so, doesn't represent a risk to the workers, doesn't represent a risk to the community, isn't going to go anywhere because we have active groundwater. Taking the dollars to put the infrastructure in, Andy's number was a little bit high, but it's in the ballpark. What do we not do? Do I stop the groundwater program to pay for that? Do I stop the retrievals? Do I stop the waste treatment plant? Those are the things we have to continually balance across the site and do the best, make the best decisions we can in a very complex environment. And it's generally not for any malicious intent that we would choose not to do something. It's simply from a practical perspective, or largely in most cases, it's worker health and safety and protecting the communities to clean up the environment, just to make the best choices we can. We operate in I'll call it a virtuous circle environment, where when we get funding from Congress, and if we safely, efficiently, effectively progress the mission and demonstrate taxpayer value as we do that, And we build awareness and support across a very broad range of stakeholders, local, regional, national, sometimes international, tribal nations. And we have alignment with the regulators that we're working on. We tend to continue to receive funding for the work we do. And so when there's misalignments, when there's areas out there that we may not perceive to be connected, that's not good for our team, our mission, or the site. And so I'm generally opting not to do those things. I want to be, we focus on partnership, we focus on teamwork, we focus on collaboration, because it takes everybody aligned in the mission to be successful. We didn't always have that. You see today alignment on the tank waste mission. Didn't always have that. So those are the things from an enterprise perspective that are very important to understand. You know, we're not there to borders. It's not the way anybody on my team operates. We're trying to make the best decision we can in a complex world. We're trying to keep everybody aligned to make sure that we progress the mission, to make sure we keep people safe while we're doing it, and maintain that longevity and the momentum of the site for decades to come. And I think we've turned the corner in some areas. It's never going to be perfect. I strive for excellence. I'm never satisfied. That frustrates my team periodically, but we're working very hard to move the mission forward, and we'll continue to do that. And you have a dedicated team of Department of Energy, contractor partners, regulatory partners, all trying to do the right thing in a very complex world. So I think that context is important, and hopefully you'll see that represented in how we represent ourselves tonight and the actions we take on the site as we move forward.
I just want to make a couple last statements. So first, just so it's clear, the state has not made a determination on that practicability question. Second, Jerry, you talked about some reference in the holistic negotiation, you know, some of the proposals that we're talking about tonight that do have some link to leaking tanks. And specifically, there's language in the milestone setting, the 22 tanks that we talked about, where energy puts a caveat in to the effect that, and I'm paraphrasing, state of Washington, if you make us retrieve other tanks during the same time frame, we're not guaranteeing we can get to 22 done. And, you know, if you want different characterization, feel free, but that's the way I read it. And to me, that's an acknowledgement that in those every 3-year tank sequencing conversations, or in some other order outside of the milestones that are already set, the state, you know, there's the potential for the state to require something different. And if that happens, then the parties will adjust and talk about what effect that has. So the point I'm trying to make is, because we specified a certain set of 22 tanks for the future, it doesn't preclude going in a different direction if circumstances dictate.
And just to be clear, the intent is still to retrieve all of the tanks. It's just a matter of which tanks you're going to go to next and so forth. That's the sequencing that Andy was talking about, at least for the next 22. And all of the tanks, single shell tank farms, we're still committed to retrieve all of them. Thank you.
Okay, before we go on, that was a good exchange and a long exchange, so I just want to acknowledge that. Can I get, just real quick before we move on, a sense for how many people have a question that they want to ask, just for our collective sense of scaling? Thank you. I think we want to work to make sure that we get everyone in, so we just ask again that that good exchange, important exchange, but that we work to make sure that we're moving through these questions as quickly as possible. I think we had one in the back to start with. And again, I haven't seen any yet online, so we'll continue to monitor there if there are any coming in online. Thank you.
I just am wondering, you're talking about 2 leaking tanks and the 22 that you're currently working on. Is it known that there are only in the entire campus and everything that's going to be worked on, only 2 problematic leaking tanks, or might there be an infinite number more?
So just to verify the question, you mentioned 2 leaking tanks out of the 22. Is the sort of inventory of leaking tanks known in the entire campus?
So thank you for the question. So we're talking about the single shell tanks that are 149 of them that were built between 1943 and 1964. And they all stopped operation in 1980. So of those tanks, there's 56 of them that we believe have leaked sometime in the past. A total amount of about 1 million gallons of total volume. Of those, I think 6, I have to double check the numbers, 5 or 6 have already been retrieved. So there are, 50 tanks that have had active leaking histories. And as mentioned before, these tanks also operated in a cascade mode where those discharges were intentionally discharged during their early phases of operation. So yes, based on, the age of these facilities and the tanks, there's varying conditions in them, but approximately 50 tanks have had some history of leaking in the past.
Thank you. Oh,
Okay. And so just
yep, sure, go ahead.
just to close out, the 2 tanks, B192 are the only ones that we currently have evidence of active leaking. And what we're talking about is changes in interstitial liquid. So think of sand or a sludge material and you have a liquid into it. What we're seeing is changes in level in that solid material of the liquid fraction. Very small changes, which are hard to detect over time. So that's really what we're talking about in tanks that had all the pumpable liquid removed and went through the interim stabilization and all the activities that Mark had talked about.
All right, we saw lots of hands in the room. So next, you've got somebody in the queue, Patrick?
Hi, we have Eric looking for challenge. Hello again. So my question is around budget. The Hanford site receives now seems to be around $3 billion per year total cleanup budget. Switching to this DF high level waste approach, can you talk about break down the that's left? Oh, it's back. Can you break down the estimated costs in bins for construction, commissioning, operations, and total project budget? And can you also? No, I think it's back. Can you also talk about, is that going to, when you're going through the negotiations, was there an understanding that making these changes, you would be receiving more $3 billion per year, and that's kind of baked into the agreement? Or are these changes going to be taking away from that $3 billion for other incredibly important projects at Hanford that has nothing to do with DF high level waste?
All right, just to paraphrase again, can you break down, this is for direct feed high level waste, can you
Yes.
break down between construction, operations, and total project budget? And can you also talk about whether or not there were assumptions baked in about whether or not there would be more than $3 billion a year? Or is that going to be taking away from other activities on site?
Oh, that's a great question. If we look at the FY 25 president's budget supports the agreement. Beyond that point, the department has made, had communications, with leadership about what we expect the cost to be of the projects as we go forward. Difficult to talk about specifically the breakdown in cost, because at this stage, we've rephased the HLW program to be focused on completion of the design first, which allows us then, based on a partially completed construction site, to then by the end of 2027, we expect to have 90% design complete across for the HLW facility. In that period, as we work up to that, that's when we'll be baselining the rest of the construction of the project going forward. So we'll have more indications there. We do have some U.S. Army Corps of Engineers assessments that were done associated with the AOAs, and kind of give ballpark figures, and I think the AOAs would make public, so those numbers are out there. We certainly will advocate for funding above 3 billion because we need to continue to work in across the site in other areas as well. But it's hard to break down any discussions now about the actual cost projected or what's going to happen in 2026, because I haven't been elected to Congress yet. And Congress provides the funding for the site that supports the mission. And so again, that goes back to the virtuous circle scope, part of the philosophy that we've been brought into the way we do business, to be as investment worthy as we can to create the conditions and the progress that wants Congress to continue to invest to progress the mission in the future. We wouldn't have signed up if we didn't think it was affordable or achievable. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy to get the funding and execute the rest of the effort. Hopefully that answers your question.
I'll just add to that, Mia. So I think you're familiar with the Hanford life cycle scope, schedule, and cost report. I always mix up how those words the order they go in. But next year, we're going to be getting another version of that report, and it's my understanding that will include updates based on the holistic agreement. And what the state of Washington does is, because we can't go back to congressional delegation and have conversations with them about the site and where we see the compliant budget numbers needing to be based on the information in that report, we will be educating them on that as well to ensure that Hanford continues to get the funding they need to meet their obligations.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Still here in the room, just go ahead and show hands and we'll get moving.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Feldman from Portland, Oregon. You know, the place that you dare not go to share your message or inform us or educate us. I'm sorry, but people in Portland generally don't know what they need to know about Hanford, and certainly these very grave decisions which are being made. I have a lot of things I'd like to ask, but I'm wondering, will the proposed plans for removing tank waste be effective and durable, given the climate extremes which are increasing and becoming more predictable with wildfires, for instance, seismic activity, and also the building of new nukes at Hanford? I mean, shockingly enough, that seems to threaten the cleanup as well. You know, you're adding more waste to the mix before you actually even clean it up. And I'll just preempt your response on that last one, because I know you'll say, well, this is what I understand, is that they're planning new small modular reactors for Hanford. And honestly, it just horrifies me. So there are climate exigencies that I think are very threatening right now, and to build more small modular reactors, which DOE supports in many ways. I just wonder why, how are you dealing with the climate crisis in these plans? And that includes building more nukes at Hanford.
Let me just quickly paraphrase. Thank you, Laura. Will the proposed plans be effective and durable in the face of climate change? You mentioned wildfire, as well as plans for building small modular reactors at Hanford. Thank you.
Okay, so that's one question in 23 parts. So I'll do the best I can to cover the key aspects of it. So from an enduring perspective, we are doing things in looking at the design of the highway waste facility that would reduce the carbon footprint. Right now, we have diesel boilers for the low activity facility to create steam that we need for the part of the process. Where that was the intended path forward with the highway waste facility as well. We've got the designer looking at electrification of boilers for the highway waste facility that would be backfit. Ultimately, the electric waste facility is ultimately operating parallel. That's really the major contributor at Hanford on the carbon footprint. We do enjoy 96% carbon-free energy already because of dams and the power plant that's already there. But we are continuing to look at those things at the relatively smaller scale, vehicles, charging stations, all the other elements that we can make the site less of a carbon emitter over time. Relative to the small modular reactor question, that's not a DOE Hanford initiative. That's the Columbia Generating Station, which is Energy Northwest, which is a tenant on our site. And the waste that they produce in the commercial nuclear facilities is not the waste that we're managing at the Hanford site. So there's a very clear distinction between the two, and it's not something that is within our portfolio, and I don't think it ever will. It's a very different, that's Office of Nuclear Energy, and that part of it. Now, I also spent, after I retired from the Navy in like 2009, I spent 4 years at Areva and 2 years at Westinghouse trying to build new nuclear plants. I'm a believer in the plants themselves because they are not carbon emitters. But the lesson I learned is it's really hard to build a new nuclear plant. And so if we think it's going to happen in the relative near term, while there's always optimism for that, I think that's going to be a longer term issue that ultimately is not our issue for the Office of Environmental Management and the DOE Hanford team. If that's ultimately a decision that's made by the commercial side, the Energy Northwest, that's really outside of our portfolio. And it's what I'll drive by when I drive on the treatment plant. But that's the only influence that I'll have on it.
What about wildfires and seismic activity? How are they doing?
I'll talk briefly about wildfires, just to be the fourth part of the one question, but we have a very robust firefighting capability at the Hanford site. We have cooperative agreements with the counties and the cities around the site. And so from a fighting prevention perspective, there's also an active tumbleweed mitigation effort that goes on at the site routinely to try and reduce the concerns of fire. We go through the annual cycle, our fire chief briefs the local mayors and folks like that. That's the fire risk side, and I think very effectively our fire team has dealt with the fires that have the site. This year we had one of 500 acres and maybe one of 800, but they were quickly handled and not a threat to the facilities on the site. The other aspect of climate change is worker health and safety. We have to worry about the physiological impacts of heat on the workers. We have employed physiological monitoring with our workers who work outside, and often shift to like a tropical shift where they start work at 3 a.m. and end by noon. So they're not out in the heat of the day. That's a global issue, not just a Hanford issue, but we are staying current with the art of practice when we're working to ensure that our workers are safe and they're doing their job.
Thank you. Still in the room here, Patrick, do you have the next in line?
About the SMR. My question was about the SMR, so that takes care of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next question.
So the lady's question does make me wonder, what about seismic issues with Hanford or the big subduction zone issues?
Just to repeat, a question about seismic risk relative to a subduction level quake.
I mean, the only thing I can add, and maybe Suzanne, you want to speak to do is that, the respective leak analyses that are performed with the site consider as appropriate, things like the seismic analysis. So there's a pretty comprehensive EIS that was done on the tank closure and the waste management EIS. That I know they looked at the affected environment and the risks, including things like seismic impacts. And to the extent appropriate, we will continue to consider things like seismic impacts in future analysis. Suzanne, if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, and then a few years ago at the waste treatment plant, they did a relook at the seismic. They did boreholes and looked at actual ground motion and very postage stamp exact science of the seismic, and looked at the nearest credible probable earthquake and the shaking, and they actually did some changes at the waste treatment plant at that time. So I think it's pretty current. The seismic information at Hanford is pretty current.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is Max Woods. I work for the Oregon Department of Energy. Thanks for coming to Oregon, by the way. Appreciate you being here. So I got probably Ryan one of these questions with 4 parts, so bear with me. Mostly for Mark, I believe. We are in Oregon, and what I'd like to know more about, if you can speak to this, is related to the offsite disposal of tank waste, primarily around and related to that, your NEPA review process that you mentioned earlier. So a couple things that I picked up on. Mark, you mentioned that part of your review between now and I believe by the end of the year is to complete your NEPA review on, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, complete your NEPA review, or at least assess what level of NEPA review you have to do. So that one part of that question is, when can we find out what level of NEPA review is going to be done for not only this project, but specifically the offsite waste disposal transportation? I should caveat that by saying, when you look at a map between Oregon, between Washington, between Hanford and Utah and Texas, Oregon is right in the middle, as well as a few other states. So your offsite disposal will probably come through our state. Right now, I'm assuming that NEPA review will have the information that I think our communities would like to see, which is what routes are you considering? What methods of transportation might you consider? How much waste will go through our communities for how long, et cetera, et cetera. So those details, but we don't have right now. I'd like to hear the thoughts on the plan to get that information and how our communities can have a opportunity to comment on that plan as well. One other thing I picked up on, Mark, what you said was part of your review is to determine if additional public comment opportunities will be available. Right now, our communities don't know, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know about the route options. We don't know what the plans for offsite disposal. And so I would think that there must be an additional comment opportunity for our communities to understand what is planned for offsite disposal and transportation. I'll stop talking right there. Thank you for coming again, for responding.
Thank you, Max. And just to paraphrase, you asked, when can we find out about the level of NEPA review that will occur for offsite transportation with respect to routes and plans and sites for disposal, amount that will be disposed? And then secondarily, how can communities comment on that?
So for as far as when, you can find out right now that we have initiated a supplement analysis toward the total pertains to the alternative treatment proposal. So what is a supplement analysis? It's a sort of DOE specific NEPA tool that looks at the body of existing NEPA documentation, for example, and decides whether or not there's been a significant change in circumstances or new information that warrants the preparation of either a supplemental EIS or a new EIS. And so that process is already kicked off. And we're looking at things like the tank closure and waste management EIS, the test bed initiative EA, the waste management programmatic EIS that the department has, and a series of other existing NEPA documentation to see what analysis exists associated with transportation risk, routes, et cetera. So that is currently underway, and we're actively pursuing that. As far as the specific routes that the pre-treated tank waste might take for offsite treatment and disposal or routing and disposal, that hasn't been decided yet. That's going to be a component of the legal review that's ongoing. So to the extent that you all have comments about that, I would encourage you to make those comments now. State of Oregon has a concern about routes that may, if at all, go through the state of Oregon for purposes of offsite disposal of pre-treated liquid tank waste. I hear you. So, make that comment now. And, there are other options that we'll consider whether or not for public engagement on the supplement analysis. So you are correct. The target for completing the assay is for end of this year, beginning of next year. But that's just one of the series of this, part of the decision-making process, if you will. We still have to do the business case analysis that I mentioned, which will compare and look at the cost of routing locally versus routing at the respective disposal facility. We have to do a weird, which will also be available to the public. We have to do a variance with our friends at EPA, so that process has to take place, as well as the critical decision process, the department's internal decision-making process. So there's I guess, a series of processes that have to be completed before we actually make a final decision about where the waste would be routed and what routes it would take.
Thank you. I know there's some additional hands in the room. First time questions.
Oh, here we go. Hello, I'd like to follow on to what Max said. I'm Matt Hendrickson, also with the Oregon Department of Energy. An overarching concern that I've heard in some of these comments is, maybe that people aren't getting the information the same as DOE has. My question, perhaps, to Mr. Silverstein and Mr. Vance is, you undergo this supplemental review to see if you need one. Is there a DOE order or some kind of public-facing document that we, the people, could read to see, well, what does signify a large change or a significant change? Because my definition of a significant change to the EIS is as they stand, with the volume increases and where the material is going to be disposed, might be very well different than the DOE. Similarly, you mentioned a business case analysis for the potential grouting plant that may be wherever it may be located for the 22 tanks and 200 west. Is that a document that the public would have availability to see what kind of assumptions were made, what kind of economic analysis was made on this, and if we may have input on those things? Thank you.
Thank you. And again, just to paraphrase, for the supplemental review, is there a DOE order or document that could be reviewed to understand what constitutes a significant change? And also for the business case, is that a publicly available document for review?
The first question, yes, DOE's implementing regulation for NEPA, 10 CFR 1021, as well as our guidance documents are available to the public. That will be on the energy.gov webpage versus the Hanford specific site. And that will contain some additional guidance and discussion about what exactly a supplement analysis is, because it's a different animal, if you will, under NEPA than a supplemental EIS. I know they probably should have named it something else because it's very similar, but it's two different things. And as I said earlier, the supplement analysis is an initial step you take to basically, if you're not sure whether or not you have a significant change in circumstances that warrants a new EIS. So you perform the supplement analysis. So those resources will help with what exactly is this, standards associated with it. As far as the business case analysis, that is typically not the type of document that's released to the public for public review. I think it's important to probably clarify again what that specific that business case analysis is for, which is mainly looking at the cost benefits and essentially the costs with an on-site or local routing option versus a disposal facility option or far away option, if you will. It's not necessarily the comprehensive comparison amongst them as much as the near or far is really the question. That is a document that will inform, again, the NEPA review.
Okay, we're about 7:15, so I just want to check in to see where we're at with respect to first round questions remain and second round questions. Any second round questions in the room as well? Just I see a few hands. Great. Okay, so it's likely that we'll go past 8. Again, we'll need to wrap up by 8:30. We do have brief closing remarks, so I think we'll have about 30 more minutes available. And we'll turn to Dan. I think you've got the mic. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Dan Sears. I'm with Columbia Riverkeeper. I'm going to read just a little bit from Ecology's website because I think it gives us a sense of why we see this agreement as significant shift, for better or for worse. Ecology said it's always been open to alternative treatment, and from the website, they're speaking in the context of what might be left in the ground or in the ground for tanks. If someone were to say, okay, we're just going to come back in, grout tanks directly in the ground. But in explaining that, they say clearly that concrete falls well short. It is porous and relative to radioactive contaminants, short-lived. And explains that vitrified waste forms are superior to grout. So when I was first kind of getting to know about tanks at Hanford, the folks who pressed upon us at that time, vitrification was very important because some of those folks had been successful in stopping Hanford from becoming BWIP, a high-level waste dump. And so they had seen the difficulty of trying to get waste in any form anywhere else. So to trust that grouted waste will never end up at Hanford, you're just asking folks to take a leap of faith, even though ecology is saying that that's hard boiled into this agreement. The second thing I would just say along those lines is Project 2025 talks about not just the forbearance going away, but absolutely the Trump administration, should they come back, using the high-level waste redefinition, the interpretive rule at Hanford. They flat out say that is the priority. So take that for what you will. It's a risk. By way of question, I just want to say, I guess this is really more towards EPA. In the testbed initiative, you have this logic that both says, really it seems to rely on the idea that because you're getting waste curies further from the Columbia River, that makes grout at this time in the, for this 2,000 gallons preferable to vitrification. And it stands in pretty stark contrast to the state's position, which is vitrification, at least at Hanford, has to be the way to go. And you've acknowledged that in the TBI process. To expand that to a very large movement of tank waste, do you expect that same logic to extend, and would you attempt to argue that vitrification is, a less durable option if you're doing it on not just 2,000 gallons, but millions, tens of millions of gallons? That's kind of the question there. And I would just say, by way of comment, from where we sit, what is already proposed, already discussed, is a significant change, requires a full environmental impact statement that involves every community, every tribe, every stakeholder along not just the area of Hanford, but the shipping routes. And I really want to appreciate Oregon Department of Energy for posing that question.
Thank you. And just paraphrase the question, and this is specifically to you, Tim, at the Environmental Protection Agency. Do you expect the logic that grout is preferable to vitrification to extend, and the vitrification is a less durable option?
So I probably want to reframe how you characterize what EPA said in that variance. I think what I would say we said in the variance is that grouting was an acceptable treatment given the request we received from the Department of Energy. Part of that request was the destination and the geological features of the destination. I want to emphasize that I think all the parties think there is a place for low activity waste being run. I think what you see in this agreement is an emphasis on low activity waste being routed as an appropriate response to the challenge we face, so long as it is deposited appropriately. It's not just a question of distance from the Columbia River. It's really, where is it going? Is that a safe place for it to be? So we will have to, we've granted one treatability variance for the 2,000 gallons in the test bed initiative. We will have to consider the particulars of future requests from the Department of Energy. So we will expect to receive those. We will be seeing if there's a way we can improve them, but we will have to take each on its merits and determine if it's appropriate to grant a variance.
It was this, just a quick, it's
both the issue of it going to someplace that is, just, I think it's just the term like geologically superior, just better location in any form. And that's why grout is okay going to a better geologic location. But you also had in the variance a discussion about the cementatious matrix performing differently than vitrification. And that just seems like not all parties agree necessarily that grout is going to perform. So even though you say you're not taking a position on a different position from the state and the feds, you kind of tip your hat in one direction. And it's concerning if you imagine blowing this up to a very large scale. So thank you for addressing it.
Yeah, I don't know that I much to add. I guess I will say, we are looking for a creative solution to a really difficult problem. What do you do with the high volume of water to be waste? The Department of Energy had a view of things, that, could take us down one path. The Department of Ecology, had a view of it, that could take us down a different path. We thought what we could offer was a way to find a compromise that would satisfy everyone's concerns, including public's, and address the very large volume of radioactive waste in a way that was appropriate. There are, yes, nuances and details that we could probably talk about. I guess that was the thrust of why we were interested in seeing if the treatability variance could be an appropriate path, and we think, at least for the TBI waste, it determined it was.
The very last thing I'll say is just the National Academy of Sciences is concerned.
The NAS looked at this, and right before they put out their final report, the draft report included community acceptance as one of the key criteria, and they dropped that, which I know part of America objected, and so do we, and I think Hanford challenged. And so I think just realistically looking forward, if you're looking at doing this again on a bigger scale, the issues or Department of Energy raised, it'd be really important for EPA. EPA had a responsibility also to consult with perhaps are impacted. Thank you.
So if I can just add a couple of things, because you also asked about the forbearance provision. So first, I guess I'll just add. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Sorry.
Don't apologize to me. I guess just speaking on behalf of what I know to be a client position, the position of goodness class is the position the state continues to adhere to with respect to disposal and handling. And concrete falling short is still the state's position with respect to disposal at Hanford. It's based on the geologic, nature of the site and also the existing risk term at the site. And Suzanne can speak in more detail about that analysis in the tank closure waste management EIS. I think that there are a couple of aspects in the variance that are pretty key. One is that there is a different geology at the two respective disposal locations in terms of a protective layer before you get to groundwater that is not present at Hanford, which does affect the rate at which the waste degrades over very long periods of time and things migrate through the substrate. So I think that all adds up to the state's comfort with grout if it's going offsite and the offsite disposal conditions that we negotiate. With the forbearance, it was the nature of it is the Department of Energy saying, yeah, we've got this interpretation that we think is appropriate and we think is legal. We know the state disagrees with it. We have other ways of getting to the same endpoint. So we're agreeing to, honor the state's concern and say, we're not going to use this tool at Hanford. That's revocable. I mean, it could go away. It could go away with the new administration. If that's the case, we have language in that forbearance that recognizes that the state will be ready to potentially challenge. And I'll say that our office is well aware of Project 2025, and we'll have a new attorney general my boss is moving on. But under my current boss, we had more than 20 suits against the prior administration, based on things like changing positions, and proposing rule changes. So I'll just leave that where it is.
Thank you. We have some first-time questions online, so I want to turn to those two before we come back into the room. Nancy Morris, if you're still on, if you could unmute and ask into the room.
Yes, hello. I was just curious, what is the proposed budget between now and 2047 for the proposed cleanup at Hanford to meet the goals that are stipulated in this agreement? Does anyone know offhand?
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
I just wondered if anyone had it calculated, and does anyone really believe that they will get what they need?
Thank you. I'll just read back into the room so everyone can hear. What is the proposed budget between now and 2047 for the proposed changes? And does anyone believe that that funding will be available? Did that sound right, Nancy? In
Yes.
paraphrase? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Well, that's a great question. A life cycle cost report provides some indications of what we've assessed the cost of the cleanup mission to be within a range of assumptions and conditions that we postulated for the budget as it moves forward. So that'll give one clue. The reality of the challenge of projecting budgets more than 3 or 4 years in advance is very difficult because it's so many factors well beyond the control of the administration. Congress holds the purse strings. It kind of goes back to the virtuous circle approach to our publicly funded endeavor. But at the macro level, we continue to work with our regulators to define what the priorities for the cleanup are. This agreement sets a course for the tank waste mission. We have a sense of the nearer term within it, but as I answered the previous question, it's hard to predict because we haven't completed the engineering analysis yet. We have a number that we've assessed that will annual cost for the operation of the waste treatment plant, the direct feed electricity waste side of it. We haven't operated that plant yet. So those will be refined over time. And generally what you see is the costs tend to go down a little bit, but then the question of what will inflation be? If you look to the future, all unknowns. And so what we do is a process, we're always 2 years out in the budget cycle, and we're planning, executing, and really projecting in the budget cycle we use for the federal government all the time. And we'll continue to evolve that process with new information, refine our estimates. Again, we believe we didn't want to sign up for something that was immediately not going to be affordable. And so we think what we've agreed to is affordable, but as you heard, there's asterisks on a lot of those milestones in the future because we don't know what the funding will look like between now and then. We don't know what our progress will be. We don't know what challenges might be. We don't know what the inflation rate might be. We don't want to know what other priorities for the administrations in between here and then would be. So it's a knowable answer. Our commitment remains to stay engaged with the state, with EPA, and talk about our needs on the budget cycle that we operate in and do the very best we can to be investment worthy as we go.
Thank you. To another question online. This is from Liz Matson, and we're going to read that out loud.
Yes, the question from Liz Matson. Can you clarify the timeline for the next big batches of negotiations for updating TPA milestones and the consent decree that are in the proposed settlement agreement?
Would you repeat the question one more time through the mic?
Sure. Can you clarify the timeline for the next big batches of negotiations for updating the TPA milestones and for the consent decree
that are in the proposed settlement agreement.
Thank you.
Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
Yep.
We have a sidebar.
We were trying to make sure we understood exactly.
Yep, we'll read it one more time.
Yeah, okay. So from Liz Manson, can you clarify the timeline for the next big batches of negotiations for updating TPA milestones and the consent decree that are in the proposed settlement agreement? And Liz says she can help if you want her to add context to the question.
Yeah, well, it's gonna be a challenge to do that from memory. So let me try and run through what I think of right now as sort of the touch points. We have an iterative process for establishing finer detailed milestones. So that process is going to involve the Department of Energy completing so I'm talking about the consent decree now. And now I'm blanking on the term, but basically a schedule. Critical path schedule, thank you, for the high-level waste facility. And we do have a hard milestone for that to be delivered. Then we negotiate the detailed milestones to complete construction and commissioning of that facility. And then tiered right after that is the same process for those two sub-facilities that I described, the waste transfer vault and the effluent management facility. Honestly, you have to.
Will the schedule start rolling in 2028? That's helpful.
Yeah.
2029.
Right, so 2028, 2029 for those negotiations. Then we jump ahead, I believe, to 18 months after the start of the high-level waste facility for a whole bundled set of negotiations to sort of map out what comes after the packages we're talking about here. So we set the milestones in the consent decree for the remaining pre-treatment functions to be completed. We reset the end date, revise those dates that we're holding fast in the TPA now for completing tank retrievals, completing tank farm closure, and treating all the waste. We also decide on something that's a detail called supplemental low activity waste treatment, which may or may not be needed at that point. That's sort of the future information that we'll be waiting on. Those all happen in a concurrent negotiation 18 months after starting the high-level waste facility. So if you take the current date of 2033, that's going to happen, 2034, 2035. My math is really bad. That's why I went to law school. But that's sort of the next big chunk. Also in that, I should add, is like discussion of, is there an interest on DOE side to continue routing waste beyond 2040? And if so, do we have offsite waste conditions to go around that? So I've identified sort of two big groups there. And I'm getting a thumbs up from Teresa that maybe I'm better.
You got it.
Okay.
I'll just add, Liz, to the extent it's helpful, the summary chart in Appendix A of the proposed changes to the consent decree in the holistic agreement does a nice job of laying out the specific dates with the negotiations and the delivery of the schedule that you asked about. It starts somewhere. We should have put page numbers on all of them, so that's a lesson learned we're taking right now. But it looks like it's about page 32, around there where the appendices, Appendix A to the consent decree lists those dates and the respective actions that Andy was just talking about.
And Andy, there's also specific schedule milestone dates for the 22 tanks and negotiations with that.
Thanks. And I'm mostly asking this. I know some of the answers to this, just for other people also. Andy was really helpful in meeting with us to to help explain and answer 1,000 questions. One thing that's confusing to me is how the negotiations in the next that come out in 5 years, when we find out what the updated dates for the high level waste facility are going to be, and then that triggers, and then maybe 14 years, this new batch of milestones once high level waste is up and running, and then layering on all of the system plan triggered negotiations that are in the paragraph 7 milestone, the kind of the laundry list that's every 6 years and every 3 years. It would be really, really helpful if ecology or DOE or all the agencies together could come up with, like, we know this is really hard to read and follow. Here's just kind of a cheat sheet of when these big things are happening and these regular negotiations are happening that really impact the schedule. If you have any comments on it, you can share them, but it would be really helpful because it's hard to put it all in order. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Any further response to that?
I was seeing if I needed to wait for you to summarize.
No.
I think I understood it,
Yep, go ahead.
so I'm just gonna jump ahead.
Yeah, please.
I think that's a great idea, actually. I mean, I mean, it would be helpful for me. It would have been helpful for me right now. But I do want to talk about the system plan thing a little bit, because that's just sort of a constant. And I mentioned that there were multiple topics that the parties originally, I mean, before this proposal, talked about every 6 years. So those are like, what are the next set of tanks to be retrieved? Do we need things like new tank capacity, contingency measures is what it's called in the language. Looking at the end dates. So there was a lot of words in these change packages, but one of the aspects of it is saying we don't need to worry about revising end dates every 6 years when we're agreeing not to like deal with them until that 18 months after the high level waste starts. So basically the cheat sheet on this, these system plan negotiations is every 3 years, energy and ecology are going to be talking about tank sequencing and contingency measures. And that's the bottom line until we get to that point where we reset the limits after the high level waste facility starts. So I hope that maybe simplifies things a bit.
Thank you. Just time check. We've got about 10 minutes remaining for Q&A before we start to wrap up here. So if there are any first round questions we haven't heard in the room, if you could raise hands. Otherwise, I know that there were a couple of follow-ups that people wanted to make. I'm seeing 3 here. I think we've got time for about 3. So let's go ahead and work through those.
All right, thanks. And Andy, I'd like to know, plan for post 2040, by the way, offsite shipping of grounded waste, maybe benefits to know. I know it's beyond the scope right here. I want to go back to what I asked earlier and kind of get into specific here in the agreement, in the draft agreement. This is for people following along, M6264. The number of your agreement. It says by the end of this calendar year, December 31st, 2024, DOE will make alternative selection for facilities and infrastructure needed to perform separation, pre-treatment and/or treatment and mode of transport for offsite disposal of low activity waste. So I read that, and correct me if I'm wrong, part of the question is, what does that mean? I read that as you make a decision as to whether to route waste, tank waste at Hanford or offsite, and you decide on mode of transportation, which seems truck, train, how you go through Oregon or straight east through Idaho, I guess. And if you do that by the end of this year, really my question is, Mark, how can you do all the other things you described in your answer to me earlier about the NEPA review, we're permitting, business case? How does all that happen in the next 5 months by the end of the year?
Yeah, so the question is with respect to in the draft agreement M6264, given the milestone there is just the end of the year, December 31st, 2024, how can you do all the other things that you mentioned with respect to analysis in the next 5 months?
it's an aggressive schedule. And at the same time, I think it's important to clarify the decision that's gonna be, intended to be made at that time versus when the work would actually start. So again, keep in mind that we're not talking about work until after 2028, the current retrieval. So there's a distinction between making decisions associated with the process and when the process actually starts. And I'm blanking now on the rest of the question. I just lost that. Oh, well, yeah, so the intent is to complete the business case analysis, which again is making, and the milestone you asked about, that's what I was going to speak to. That decision for that date is really a question about, are you going to build a grout plan at Hanford, at the Hanford site versus using off-site facility? So because building a new facility at Hanford is going to be a pretty significant action. So that's really what the question or decision is associated with that milestone that you were asking about specifically. Don't worry, anything on that.
Thanks. Yeah, if you look in the following milestone sequence, it really leads into steps when it goes into then define the on-site facilities that, like we we're talking about, then negotiate and establish commitments to construction. So really, I think Mark said it pretty well, that decision up front was really geared at least to identify the on-site facility we had to build. You also will see there's some language saying, if we end up building that local ground facility outside the CUE project, then it has some scheduling impacts to the downstream milestones. So that's really what that is, with the follow-on execution process.
It also says mode of transit. It doesn't just say, just to be clear, it doesn't just say routing offsite also. It's the mode of transit, but part of the.
So the follow-up or the clarification is that the milestone speaks to mode of transport as well?
Right, and at least from my perspective, when we've written that the mode of transport was then to form that we have to build and design, it's actually back up. One large piece of this is the on-site treatment capability, which is a TISCR-like system to pre-treat this waste. So this is the supernate with all the C's removed. And the structure there was to identify mode in terms of what we build in that plant is in terms of the transfer system to that mode, whether it's rail, whether it's truck, and how you can design perspective.
Like the on-site transport, that's how you do that.
Yeah, when we put the words together, that's what we were trying to communicate is the early decisions about the physical aspects of it. So then we can go talk and set up the milestones for construction. And I think one of the key pieces is, as we put that together with understanding that, we're not going to be retrieving those tanks until after complete the consent decree dates, 28, 29 time period, and trying to get all those physical upgrades in place to pre-treat, to store, and to move wherever we move it to. So that's really what that decision is based on, is to get to those construction activities and define those going forward. I don't know if that helps, but that was what the language is trying to get to, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, just a couple more thoughts. First, that mode of transport decision comes into play when we talk about that just-in-time production, because, whether it's rail or truck sort of dictates what that rolling 3-month inventory looks like based on sort of how it moves off the site. So that's information the state's going to need. And we then intend to sort of establish that in the permit. But I also just want to, and Dan Sarah's made some comments about the time frame last night as well. These dates were negotiated sort of, it took a while to get this all put into place, let's just put it that way. And whether the date is like exactly lined up with what is possible where we are sitting right now is something that I think is appropriate to comment on and for us to take back. So these are all proposals at this point. I mean, it's not like saying that, that 12/31/24 date is immutable. So, if we need to make an adjustment around completing supplement analysis or what? I mean, that's something that we can talk about after public comment. I guess I'm saying it's a good public meeting.
I was being too subtle when I referred to it as something like a target date or the, an aggressive schedule. So Andy said it with real time.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 5-ish minutes. I know that there are at least 2, maybe 3 hands remaining. So just to emphasize for everyone, if we can be concise, that will serve us well in trying to get out of here closer to 8:30. Thank you.
I think this one might be for Delaware. So the waste treatment plant, direct feed high level waste, is that, are those logs gonna meet the acceptance criteria for Yucca Mountain still? Is that the plan or?
So
The short answer to that is yes, direct feed doesn't change any of the, form or format or function of the highway waste facility. And, like I said, the only thing it would really impact in earlier operations is maybe a few more camps.
So the question was just because we got to the answer, but again, for folks online, thank you. Does the waste treatment plant DFLAW approach still meet the waste acceptance criteria for Yucca Mountain? And you heard the response. Okay, next question. Thank you.
Yeah, back to transport. I certainly don't want this waste going through Oregon, especially along and through the Deschutes, Wild and Scenic River. But I also don't want it going to Texas or New Mexico or near New Mexico or Clive, Utah. I know community members there. I've spoken to them. They do not want this waste. They have water sources to protect as well, like the Oglala aquifer, which is very important for them. And I guess my question is, well, without community buy-in or involvement, it's going to be a bump in your road. I know it sounds maybe improbable, but it will be. And I'm wondering, are you doing these kinds of hearings in Andrews, Texas and Clive, Utah for community members to understand this oeuvre that's being proposed, this movement of waste?
Thank you. Just to paraphrase again, will there be opportunities in the communities where there are potential movement of waste in Utah or Texas to comment or be involved to understand those decisions?
That's a great question, and actually, something I talked about that not long ago. We definitely see a need to talk to the states of Utah and Texas, talk to the intervening states where the paths may go, and work with those states between now and the point where we would actually start to ship to gain greater alignment and understanding, appreciation of the nature of the waste itself and how we're going to ship it, all those things. I think we do need to have those conversations within the Office of Environmental Management. We have an organization that does a lot of state and intergovernmental engagements, and that's going to be part of it. There's a number of organizations that meet routinely with the state, not only attorneys general, but also with the directors of ecology, and have a lot of those conversations, not only in the states that are doing cleanup, but the states that are, in some cases, receiving waste. I think it's absolutely necessary for us to develop that broad awareness and the teamwork and appreciation of the, we can tell you it's a benign risk, but until we've demonstrated to you that's true, it's not real. And the partnership between Department of Energy, state of Washington, certainly Oregon, because of the proximity to the Columbia River and the long-standing relationship we have with Oregon as well, we see that as an absolute need. It's helpful though, I would say, encourage you to include that in public comment, because it's something I want to make sure that gets on the list of things we're going to work together. And as Mark talked about, we have time. We have time to do that. And as you recognize, between now and the end of the decade, there might be new administrations, there might be new state, new governors, new people that are interested, people less interested. It's an ongoing effort. And the one key theme that I hope I referred to it before, this mission takes a village, takes everybody working together in alignment. We're never probably going to satisfy everybody completely, but at the end of the day, we have to do something. and we have to move the mission forward because not doing something, time is our common enemy. And you know, the magnitude of the risk goes up in the state of Washington and frankly, Oregon, with the proximity of the Columbia River increases. We can't let that happen either. It's a hard question. But I think we've demonstrated the ability to create the alliance, create the awareness, create the partnerships in moving issues like this forward, and we just have to stick to it.
Jerry, I thought I saw your hand up. Did you have a second question before we wrap? Okay, great. Yes, no, I know that you had headed out when I made my first announcement. Well, with that, I think we're ready to move on to final kind of closing remarks here. Just a couple of quick reminders from my end before we turn to the panel again, that we have, September 1st closure of the comment period. There's information on the Hanford.gov website and this postcard that you can take with you. We would also really appreciate any feedback about your experience at this meeting through that other link to the evaluation form. And just to hit it home, tonight's session is not part of that formal public record, but you can refer to the recording of tonight's session to inform your public comments. And we'll have this posted by early next week. The other two sessions are already online on both the Department of Energy and the Department of Ecology website. So thank you again for your participation. Several of you have been with us all along the way at each of our meetings. We appreciate your time, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Hammer.
So I get to go first. I'll be really quick. Thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate your interest in this agreement and the site in general. I think you already knew, but I think tonight's conversation illustrated just all the complexity of the site presents, all the complex relations that we are trying to develop and create new ones, right? As we were just talking about in the transport industry. And we do it in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty, engineering uncertainty, technical uncertainty, political uncertainty, what sort of policies and budgets might we face in the future. This is not an easy undertaking, and I know you know that. I think Brian said it well before. We have a lot of people who are doing their very best to take all of that and find the right path forward to use the taxpayer dollars well and effectively to reduce the risk to the American public, to the people who live near the facility, to the people who might be in the path of wherever the waste is going to ultimately be disposed. We're all doing our level best to find the right path to the best possible outcome, knowing that whatever we do, not everyone's going to be happy and maybe even understand completely why we did what we did. We're going to keep trying. We hope tonight's effort demonstrates that. Thank you.
So I'll keep my remarks brief as well. I first want to say thank you for coming out tonight. I know several of you traveled to be here with us and were on the road show with us for all three public meetings. And I really appreciate you taking the time. It really shows how important this topic is for all of you and for the communities impacted by the Hanford cleanup. So really just appreciate you taking the time. You asked us some really good questions, and I hope that our answers were informative as you seek public comment. And again, just thank you for the time, and I'll pass that to Brian.
I'll also thank you all for being here. This is a complex mission. It is a complex problem. The folks that are sitting at the table here and many others, recognize the challenges. We didn't create the issue, but we, as a Department of Energy and as federal government, we have an obligation to clean it up, and we're doing our very best to do that. And we'll continue to do that. We're always challenged a bit by the uncertainty of the budget. And we do our best every year to take every dollar that we receive from Congress and apply it in the very best way we can to progress the mission. And welcome these conversations because frankly, we generally are focused on doing our very best, but I learned in areas that we've communicated well. I also learned in areas that we maybe not communicated as well in the past. And so that's helpful for us as well, because a lot of our effort is spent in outreach and trying to raise awareness and help people understand the actions and the decisions and the progress that we're making to this very complex problem. So thank you all. I really do appreciate the time, your commitment which is consistent with ours, to a safer, cleaner, dangerous site and a brighter future for the Tri-Cities community and beyond. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks all. Good night. Safe travels.